Hello, everyone. This is Marilyn Turkovich, Director of the Charter for Compassion, and I am very excited for our global read today. It's the kickoff for our 2022 series, and it is with Steve he told me how to pronounce his name, Kill LA. I think there's more grace attached to the way that it can be said. But he is with Lisa Berkeley today. Lisa has been, I should say, one of our lead coordinators for the Charter for Compassion's peace sector, and has been involved in a number of global reads. And so it's my honor to present Lisa in conversation with Steve. She will be asking him some questions intermittently throughout, but we've asked Steve if he would just open up the session right now with just talking with us and talking about the book. And I'm going to turn it over to Lisa in hopes that she will tell us a little tiny bit about herself, and then she will introduce Steve and we will move on. Thank you so much. Lisa?
Thank you, Marilyn. Yes, it's been my honor to work with the Charter, and it is as great, if not more, of an honor to be sitting here with you, Steve. Thank you so much for joining us. For transparency's sake, I've had the opportunity to have attended a couple of the workshops that IEP has done at Stanford University, and I've even had the honor of having a couple of conversations with you directly. So I'm happy to be continuing this conversation today. Just a little bit, because people can Google you. Steve is the founder, and are you executive director?
Still executive director, yep.
Okay, fabulous. Of the Institute for Economics and Peace. And he has done outstanding work. Like I said, all of his credentials you can Google, but what I appreciate about him is he is truly a visionary in bringing data-driven research into the field of peace and security, and really, I'll say, changing the conversation about what peace means. And within that context, he has been nominated for, I believe, a couple of times for a Nobel Prize in Peace. And he just continues to travel the world, giving us new concepts and greater understanding of how do we achieve peace and how actually feasible it is to achieve global peace. And so with that note, I'd love for us to jump into, actually, Steve, your story about why peace.
Sure. Well, not sure exactly where to start. It's such a big topic, but I think maybe I might just start a little bit on the background and then maybe just move into how I got involved in peace. So I think there's some, I think that part's interesting and quite profound. So actually, the background's in business. I've set up a couple of international IT companies. First one ended up publicly listed on NASDAQ, the second on the Australian Stock Exchange. So made quite a bit of money out of that, and would have been maybe 30 years ago now, maybe a bit less, 27 years ago. I started to get involved in developmental aid. So I set up a family foundation to work with the poorest of the poor. And so then to do interventions which were substantially life-changing. So that took me to a whole range of countries around the world, and a lot of them tended to be war zones because that's where a lot of the poorest people reside. So I spent a lot of time in war zones, near post-war zones, and then it would have been probably about 17 years ago now. I was in North Kivu in the Congo, which is one of the more violent places in the world. And I'm walking through there, I started to think, what are the opposite of all these stressed out nations I'm spending time in? What are some of the most peaceful? And what could I learn from them to bring back into the projects I was doing? In a lot of ways, it was a fantasy question, nothing more, nothing less. You know how we get these questions. And so I came back, searched the internet, and couldn't find a list of the nations of the world ranked by their peacefulness. Certainly there was the stuff on these are the nations in war, These are the nations which are most fragile, but nothing on the most peaceful nations in the world. And so that's how the Global Peace Index was born. And in many ways, if you think about it, because if a business guy like myself can be walking through Africa and wonder what are the most peaceful nations in the world, and it hasn't been done yet, how much do we actually know about peace? And certainly from a business background, what I realised, if you can't measure something, I don't think you can truly understand it. You can't understand it, then if you can't measure it, then how do you even know whether your actions are helping you or hindering you in achieving your goals? You simply don't. And so that was the start of the journey. So in many ways, I ended up just this guy accidentally stumbling into peace. But that now has been the driving passion for me for the last 17 years. And so I've just really dedicated myself to it. The more I moved into it, the more I realized we didn't really understand peace. And like even to the point when I first did it, so you've got to understand this was the height of the Iraq War. Okay, they invaded there maybe 12 months, 18 months before. And so peace, I was told, particularly in Washington, by my friends there and other associates, you can't, if you want to get taken seriously, don't use the word peace. I said, why don't you call it human security? And so I spent a lot of time bouncing this one back and forwards, but human security, it's just a shriveled concept of peace, just a shriveled concept. So I stuck with the Global Peace Index. And so, but that, as we can see now, is really quite prophetic. So what I was really trying to do was take peace and get it into the middle ground. And so that sort of people would realize it's something practical, something tangible, something which could be measured, something that you could actually ascribe an economic value to, because a lot of people aren't motivated by compassion and motivated by other things, particularly money. They'd see themselves as being the pragmatists of the world. And so if you can actually attach monetary value to peace, you've got a conversation you can start to have with them about peace. Now, for people like ourselves, we come at it from the compassionate perspective, like the alleviation of human suffering. We went back to the foundation, family foundation I established. It's called the Barrack Charitable Foundation. So the aim of that was to work with the poorest of the poor, do interventions which are substantially life-changing and touch as many people as possible. But the underlying motivation of all is really to alleviate human suffering. And to some extent, that's what peace is about. At a very, very simple level is to alleviate human suffering. And really, compassion, if we're coming from compassion, that's the grounds we're coming from as well. So that's just a start, I suppose. That's a start. I could keep talking for longer, but I'll probably good to engage in a conversation, Lisa. You ask me questions and I'll take a couple of minutes responding to each of them. That's probably give us the best way to ground this conversation, I suppose.
I think that's probably a good idea. And what I will say for those who are watching with us live, you are welcome to type any questions in the chat box or the Q&A box here on Zoom. So I appreciate your response, Steve. I know I asked you kind of a bigger question about why peace, and I think where I was going really was like, what was your personal journey? And you answered that for sure. I was touched in the book about the way that you have woven what I'll say intellectual concepts and data-driven research with your personal stories, and so that really helped to ground it and integrate the heart and compassion into the conversation. But I want to move on and talk a little bit more about how you've arrived at measuring peace. You talk in the book about the role of systems thinking and our interconnectedness, and certainly within the compassionate communities and with a lot of the people who are looking at peace from more of a spiritual perspective, The recognition of interconnectedness is so important. Can you share more about how you got to systems thinking? And then we can then move from there on to talking about how relevant systems thinking is when looking at positive peace and also defining positive peace.
Right. Okay. So one of the things I realized really early with peace, there are many, many different types of peace. I mean, a lot of it depends on the consciousness of the person who's working on it, and sort of many angles, the angle they're coming from. So like quite often the political version of the peace is when the guns fall silent at the end of a war. But as we know, that still doesn't create structural peace. For others, it might be, let's say, inner peace, which might be the absence of an afflictive emotion, or it might be peace, might be a concepts of equanimity. Other forms of peace, so can be peace can simply be the lack of crime. Okay, can be defined as the lack of crime. So what I realise is definition of peace which you want is relative to how you want to use it. Okay, and so that's quite profound in a lot of ways. Quite profound in a lot of ways. So where we came from, the Institute for Economics and Peace, is we really came up from a societal perspective, and that'll move us into systems thinking. So we've got two types of peace we mainly use. And so the first is what we call the absence of violence or fear of violence. And the Global Peace Index is built around that. Now, that's an excellent definition of peace, because what it means is it's something most people can agree with, okay? And it's also something which is quite tight, tangible, and you can actually now build out the metrics around it. So, for example, let's say the Global Peace Index, it's got three different domains in it, and then two ways of being able to look at it. So the three names or domains, internal peace and security, and that's things like, let's say, level of violent crime, homicide rates, the number of police per 100,000 population, number of people in jail per 100,000 population, acts of terrorism, availability of guns, etc., etc., etc. The other two domains are a lot more self-evident. So the first one's ongoing conflict, which we all grasp, and the other one is militarization. And so quite often people will say, well, militarization, doesn't that make us safe? Shouldn't that be a positive? But we say, no, it's the absence of violence or fear of violence is the definition. So you've got the military for two reasons. One, you want to use it for your geopolitical advantage, or two, you're worried and scared that your neighbours may use their military against you. So either way, it fits the definition. And so that's the Global Peace Index. So now that's a very powerful definition for developing a measure of peace. And it's a negative one, if you like. You're looking at the absence of something. Now, that's excellent, but tells you nothing about what creates peace. Okay, now we start to now look at what creates peace. That now we call positive peace. And that's the attitudes, institutions, and structures which create and sustain peaceful societies. Now, this is where it gets really interesting, and we start to now move towards systems. This is where it gets really interesting. So what we wanted to do, because we're sort of empirically based and we're very, very strong in maths, was to take an approach which wasn't our values. Okay, so how do you arrive at something which isn't your own values? And that's one of the issues with peace. Quite often it's people's values, and people don't see values the same way, as we know. So what we did is we then used mathematical modelling and a whole lot of statistical analysis to determine what are the factors most closely associated with highly peaceful societies as measured by the Global Peace Index. And so we've got about 50,000 different data sets, indexes, attitudinal surveys we use down here in Sydney. So we now do the mathematical modelling, statistical analysis against them to get the factors most closely associated with highly peaceful societies. And then what we did was we took them further and used other mathematical techniques to clump them together. And so we got rid of the data sets, which were pretty crappy, got rid of then once where they were overlapped, got rid of them as well. And then we filtered it down to this group. And so then once we did this analysis to, if you like, group them together, we came up with 8 different pillars, if you like. And we call 8 pillars of positive peace. And what we realized is they're all systemically and come together. They're all part of the one thing. And that's really started to move us into systems thinking. So, but I'll just give you an example. So if we're looking at the 8 pillars of positive peace, they're things, and none of these are counterintuitive. They're things like well-functioning government, strong business environment, equitable distribution of resources, free flow of information, high levels of human capital, acceptance of the rights of others, low levels of corruption, good relationships with neighbours. So as you can see, none of them counterintuitive, but the thing is, they really come together as a system. And as we delved further into it, we could really see this with analysis. So
some of this, and I would love people to see that. This is actually from your Global Peace Index from 2021, which people can find on your website. So I just wanted to give people a visual because it really helps to support what you're saying.
Great. Okay. Oh, thanks for throwing that up, Lisa. And so, so just if we think of, let's say, a lot of countries will focus on, let's say, sound business environment, high levels of human capital, because they think that'll increase their GDP and their wealth. But what we find is if you just focus on those two, in fact, you're slightly more likely to increase or decrease peace than actually increasing. Now, just give you an idea of how this stuff works systemically. What I want you to think about, let's say, well-functioning government, low levels of corruption, free flow of information. Now, this will just give you an idea of the systemic nature of this stuff. So does government affect corruption, or does corruption affect government? Does government affect a free press, or does the free press affect the way the government functions? And does corruption restrict and affect the flow of information, or does the flow of information affect corruption? You see, you can't pull any of it apart because it all interacts together. So there's these, what you'd term in systems, these mutual feedback loops. And as we started to dig into that, that then got us really interested in systems and started to understand systems. What we realized is there's not, everyone talks about systems, like we have education systems, we have the criminal justice system, we can keep going with system after system after system. And people talk about sort of systems all the time, but we really don't think and we don't work that way. It's not the way society is structured. And just philosophically, just to drive this home, and I think this is quite profound. So if we think, normally we think in terms of causality, cause and effect. Here's a problem. What was the cause? Let's fix the cause and the problem goes away. We see it all the time. Now, that originated and that with the physical sciences, and like that's great breakthrough. So if we look empiric science, it's based around the concept of physical cause and effect, and that's the breakthroughs which have caused the great technological advances of the last 500 years. Because what it meant was now you could take something and if the cause, if the effect didn't influence the cause, then it was repeatable. And that's the basis of science. Here's an experiment. It's repeatable. We can look at it again and again and again. And now we've got knowledge. And anyone who wants to run the experiment has the same knowledge. That's the basis of empiricism. So it's based off the study of the physical world. And like this is etched into our brains also. Because if you think, I throw a ball in the air, I catch it, and it always comes down at the same space. And some people catch balls a lot better than me. But so, but it's the physics of it that's built into us. It's why we walk down the street. Why we walk down the street. Okay, it's because of this physical cause and effect, which is built right into the subconscious of our brain. But that's not the way societies operate and biological organs operate. They operate as a system with mutual feedback loops. So what happens, the effect influences the cause all the time, okay, all the time. So now, as I'm speaking to you here, I'm actually changing your consciousness. As your consciousness changes, as you get new information, that'll impact the way you actually ask your next questions to me. So we're engaged in a conversation, mutual feedback loop. Think of two political parties. One puts out a manifesto, the other one responds with the changes to its posturing or its manifesto itself. The first political party now adjusts again with the way it'll come back and criticize the other political party about its response to its manifesto. So this cause and effect is just, in societies, it's an illusion. It's an illusion. And so what happens, so with cause and effect, we see politicians of all stripes using it all the time. So now it is somewhat effective, but we can see, because the issues within society, it's hardly fully effective. And so what we're thinking, what we're saying in systems thinking is really a profound new way of starting to now look at the way societies are structured and operate. So a lot of people on this call, and a lot of us are engaged in universities. They're the epitome of our knowledge, let's say, the pinnacle of our knowledge. Now, if you look at the structure of a university, it's based on a causal concept. So what happens is you've got different departments. Over time, those which study different areas, over time, those departments are broken up into sub-departments, which are more and more and more specialised. If you want to get published, you go to a magazine or a journal. And that journal is very specific around one specific topics. We look at the way, let's say, the UN structure. Like, I love the UN, okay? It does a lot of great work. But let's think of somewhere like the Sahel, which is probably one of the more intractable problems on the earth at the moment. So you've got the Islamic militias committing terrorism, fighting around there. You've got large flows of refugees. You've got very, very weak governance. You've got the low levels of food, low levels of water. You've got population which is out of control. So you've got all these issues. So now, if you look at it, it's all systemic in nature, okay? But so what have you got? You've got the UN, the HCR in there working in the refugees. You might have UN peacekeeping in there, trying to keep the peace somewhere. You'll have UNDP in there working on the development. They'll have to be siloed again, maybe have WASH programs and then other standard development. You'll have the UN Population Fund in there working on birth control. You'll have the World Bank in there sort of working on the governance in these countries, which in many, many ways is very, very weak. And then you might have other groups there trying to stimulate the economy in other shape, ways or forms. And I could keep going, but it gives you an idea of just the way we tackle these problems, but they're systemic in nature. Unless we can start to understand the problems systemically, and we don't do that, unless we understand the problems systemically and then devise the institutions which are best matched and with the right skill sets to be able to tackle the systemic problem, we're not going to get too far.
For sure, for sure. I want to go back to something you said a couple minutes ago that's actually really interesting about how we influence one another in our consciousness and engage with one another, and then how positive peace can be, how do I want to say this? How positive peace can be utilized as a tool for policymakers to create a new kind of a loop where any sort of competition becomes what through the charter we like to call I just
Co-opetition.
Co-opetition, thank you, where we positively compete, cooperate with one another. How do you see the work that you're doing? I'm sorry. How do you see the work that IEP and you are doing feeding into that loop?
Yeah, so I think it gets complicated. So co-opetition, I love the term because you see in business, you see it all the time actually, because you see two companies competing in one area and cooperating in another. Okay, and even sometimes cooperating at the subset of areas where they'll be competing at a more macro level. So it's very, very common expression in business. But there's one other element in this which I think you're all working on, and that's consciousness. Okay, so in many ways there's really old Indian concept that knowledge is structured in consciousness. So depending on the state of your consciousness, that'll determine what knowledge you actually pull in and operate around and bring in to sort of, which you'll then utilize. And so for co-opetition, you really need to have the right level of consciousness to be able to do it in many ways when you're looking at it from a political dimension. So quite often politics is a win-lose game, okay? I win, you lose, okay? It's the structure of either you're in government or you're not in government. You're on the backbenches, you're in the ministry sitting on the corridors of power. And for me, in a political sense, there needs some way of being able to change that in some shape, way, or form. So actually, power is more shared, okay, between competing parties. Now, a presidential system, that's very, very hard, okay. But if you get down to some of the other forms of democracy, where you will find, let's say, if you look at the German governments, for example, they tend to be a mixture of a number of parties coming together collectively to share power. So I think in some ways, when you're looking at those kind of things, it works well. If you're coming down and looking at the US political system, when you're looking, I'm not an expert on it, so to say something which is wrong, listeners are just going to have to forgive me. But I think you've got two seats for each state, okay, and sort of that's fine, but it's very, very hard to then to actually sort of get new parties which come up and get parts of when the politics, and like the US has been stuck in a two-party system for a long while. So as you expand out and you get more parties, you're more likely to, in a political sense, to get this concept of co-opetition, okay, because the power does get shared around more.
Yeah, interesting. So along these lines, but also opening up to anywhere in your research, in your area of expertise, I'm going to go back to the personal a little bit. And, you've done so much work contributing to different aspects of peace. What area speaks most to your heart? What do you love most and find most fascinating?
Well, to be honest, it's not so much reflected in the work of the Institute for Economics and Peace. It's about societal peace. I think it's the concept of inner peace is the stuff which is sort of, because which really sort of put a lot of work in. So a lot of ways, I do a lot of meditation. I may average 2 hours a day meditating in some shape, way, or form. There's a lot of meditation techniques you can do in activity as well as just sort of sitting on a mat. So I think that the inner peace is the thing for me. Now, I think also as we're starting to look at that, and a lot of it based around Buddhist philosophies, it's really been profound in terms of the way it's sort of structured my view of the world and reality. But in one extent, you can only go out as far as you can go in, okay? So if you're sort of got a whole lot of really messy emotions, okay, and you go out and create peace, you're not going to get too far. And you'll notice a lot of the time, and people can pick on really just causes when they're doing this, really just causes. But a lot of people, when they're trying to create peace, they find an enemy to go and fight. And that's the inverse Peace. Okay. So let's look at where you guys are coming from. Compassion. Okay. There's the dirty, rotten rascal who's creating all the issues and problems through his greed and selfishness. I'm going to go out, I'm going to swat him with my peace swatter. What are the emotions which are coming out? They're certainly not compassionate, are they? Not compassionate. So again, that's what I mean to some extent. So, like one of the Leo Tolstoy is one of my champions. Okay, like I just think of it. Read his life story. It's one of the more amazing life stories, and one of the more great transformations which a character can have through their lives as well. And this idea of sort of we're born and we don't change is crazy. It's just really not true. It certainly hasn't been true for me, I can say that. Mm-hmm. But Tolstoy once said, and this was just after he'd written War and Peace, he said, and he'd written another book it's almost impossible to read and understand called The Kingdom of God Lies Within. And so basically his hypothesis was this: we've spent all of history finding the bad guys and trying to then wipe the bad guys out. But in the process, trying to wipe the bad guys out, we become them. And therefore, this hasn't worked, finding the bad guys. Therefore, we need to turn within and find peace within. And that's what he meant, the kingdom of God was within. And sort of now that him and the Mahatma Gandhi, and a lot of people probably already know this, but him and Mahatma Gandhi used to correspond together for years. And Mahatma Gandhi built civil resistance movements based around Tolstoy's ideas. They both philosophies shared were very, very similar, except for one thing: Tolstoy gave up on the system, and Mahatma Gandhi wanted to change the system. Yeah. So now back to sort of me personally, sort of what moves me. So you're getting a feel for the sort of things which move me out from this. So one of the things which has been really, really impactful in my life is a couple of very, very simple Buddhist concepts. And I can tie these back to our modern understanding of reality as when we hit it through quantum mechanics. So the first thing is the concept of dependent arising. Okay, nothing rises independent of its surroundings. Okay, so you think you contacted me, or probably more likely one of the people who work for me contacted you. Okay, and we're in control of this situation. I'm here talking, you're interviewing me, and here we go. But even the very, very words I'm using, how did I learn to speak? My mother, speaking my mother's tongue, how do I? Okay, I didn't invent the English language. Okay, it's dependent on a whole range of things which came before me. I'm sitting here because of the technology. Okay, also because a number of other people were kind enough to contact someone and they arranged some things and we're there. And so you can extrapolate this out to an incredibly big extent. So that's dependent arising. We only arise because the environment around us. And that's what's really important, let's say, in the work of the Institute for Economics and Peace and Positive Peace. It's working on that macro dependent arising. So you've got another thing which is called the sum of the aggregates. Okay, the sum of the aggregates goes, well, nothing is intrinsically there. Okay, nothing actually intrinsically there. So if you look at my hand, for example, okay. Mm-hmm. All right, the hand's made up of fingers, okay? And so what are the fingers made up of? Sinews and channels for blood. What is all that made up of? That's made up of cells. What's that made up of? That's made up of the atoms. And what are the atoms made up of? They're made up of quarks. And you can just keep going down and down and down and down, and nothing has got anything which is actually really tangible. It only exists because of our view. Now, there's another one called nominal designation. Okay, and nominal designation basically says, things are only dependent on the senses you've got to perceive it and the position you're coming from. So back to my hand, okay? So it's an instrument, it's a tool, isn't it? But to a fly, it's a dinner plate. So its nominal designation is really dependent on the way you see things, okay? So for a compassionate person, this is with knowledge structured in consciousness, if you've got strong compassion, you look at someone who's suffering and you want to alleviate the suffering. Okay, if you're someone who's jailed someone because they're political opposition, you'll see they're suffering and think that's good. Okay, they're not going to be opposing me in the future. And that's an example of knowledge structured in consciousness, or nominal designation, if you like, in an extreme sense. So as we're looking at that, so you've got that. So you take the sum of the aggregates, and like if you break it down, you can't break anything down, including your consciousness, down into anything solid. Okay, and that's where quantum mechanics takes us. Okay, so we look at it, you just take something down ever and ever lower until you get to the point where things are just wave functions. They're not even particles. They only become particles when we interact with them. Otherwise, they're wave functions. Very, very hard to wrap our minds around, but that's the way it operates. So those things, when you bring them together, create sort of, how can I put it? It's a world which is massively different. It's one in which the concept of individual origination, in other words, I exist independent of myself. My consciousness is something which is independent of the world, and I'm in control. It's just simply an illusion.
Completely, completely. I so appreciate your perspective on this, and I certainly share it. You know, I'm jumping a little bit because I'm reminded when you talk about the Buddhist perspective, you know, when Trump rose to power in the U.S. or was elected, it I believe it was truly an opportunity for us to define further who we are as a culture. And I'm reflecting on, I believe it's in the Lotus Sutras, where there's a story, there's a narrative that talks about this horrible despot of a leader who just is violent and vile and abusive and just terrible. And the community is sure when he dies that he is going to go to the Bardo, you know, their version of hell, right? And it turned out, sure enough, when he dies, that it's revealed that he was actually the Buddha, coming to give people the opportunity to experience or choose compassion. And
Yeah.
I'm always intrigued by that story because when I look at the state of the world and I reflect on like the stories that you've shared throughout your book, and then I can only imagine how many more, I can't help but wonder if we were to meet people with an open heart and with both the intellectual knowledge of positive peace as well as some form of internal practice and consciousness around positive psychology, how what a different world it would be, and how we could really move things forward in a more caring way. And when we then think about that and then look at the state of the world as far as the planet, you know, I reflect. I'll say that I find myself reflecting a lot in this area of how are we going to further come together. And I think that for people who are watching this as well, they're looking for what can they do, because so many people feel helpless and hopeless. And I appreciate what you just spoke about because it really is recognizing the interconnectedness, um, and also recognizing that if we do our meditation work in living and walking and breathing or just sitting on the mat, it can create a shift. Can you, this may be a little bit putting you on the spot in a completely different area, but can you share with people who are watching what, how they can, like, what is a day in your life like, and what can they learn from that, or what other ideas do you have that maybe they can pursue for creating greater peace?
Sure.
Sorry, it was very long.
Right. Okay. So what is a day in my life? The days, well, I guess with the COVID, they started to become a little bit more more similar. Okay, so I guess the first thing is, are we in lockdown or aren't we in lockdown? Because if we're in lockdown and working from home, it drives me crazy. But if we're not in lockdown, then I'm sort of going to the office every day. So I've got, my life's a mixture of many things. I've got a big family. So I've got the wife. We've been together a long while. We've got 4 kids, 12 grandkids. They're unlike America. They all live in the same city, because in Australia, we don't tend to move cities a lot, whereas in the US, kids go to college, they're off into a different city. And I think to some extent that's not healthy for Americans. I think those family bonds is something which is just really, really, really important in terms of helping us develop sort of a good, strong, positive emotions. So it's a tight family. So like Christmas Day, we had 34 people over here, and all the family, just the immediate family. And so we live right on the ocean. So I walk out my back door, I walk into the ocean, one of the best surfing beaches in Sydney. And so sort of a late afternoon, sort of none of the adults wanted to go in the water, but I was really keen. So I got 6 of the grandkids, and we're in the water, in the water swimming, and sort of there are 2 sets of girls. So 3 of them 8, 3 of them 6, and I've got them hanging on to my fingers like this as we're going through the waves, diving under them. Because they're all really competent in the water, because we just all grow up in the water. Yeah, and that was just the best feeling. That was the highlight of Christmas Day. Got 27 presents, me individually, on that day, and I'm just back to thinking that we're just living so. And everyone's trying to be nice, aren't they? That's why they've all brought me presents. But it's just back to this massive material world. So that's a little bit of into my life. My wife's set up a foundation. It works with kids with suffering from trauma, using a type of therapy called play therapy. So a lot of her mental energy revolves around that. She's very family orientated. So like a lot of the interactions with the family, and a lot of the ways, it's really important. I think in many ways we're losing track of just the importance of bringing kids up in loving environments. We're getting quite often too male and female. Don't want to get into gender on this too much, but we're a lot more focused on our careers than bringing up the kids and the next generation. Okay, you want them to be empathetic and having a sense of being loved and cared and being the centre of the universe. That's what makes them strong. So now we come back and my work, I'm sort of doing a lot of podcasts around the book, Peace in the Age of Chaos. Anyone listening, I suggest you buy Peace in the Age of Chaos. Get it anywhere.
You can see it.
You get it from any of your favourite places. So I'm doing a couple of, maybe 2 podcasts a week, like this one, revolving around the book. They're all around the world. They range from places in the UK to the US to India, just to name some of the places which I'm doing it. I'll spend some hours every week editing reports. Okay, so for each of the reports which come out of IEP, I do the final edit on. That takes quite a bit of time. I work on the structure of the research we do. So one of the qualities I seem to have is to be able to, find the white space on a canvas, okay, and then paint it, okay. So that seems to be a quality I've had through my life for some reason. Don't know why, but it's there. So like put a lot of time into the research and the major thrust of the research. I don't do any research. But a lot of time into sort of the thrust of the research, and then sort of the reviewing sort of the directions we're going with it. So quite a time like that. Got a lot of management. Like I spend I'll get off this call and I'll have to get off right on time because I've got a call into the US. The guy who runs our US office for our weekly catch up. Last night at 5:30, sort of got on with the guy who runs our Brussels office, okay, for example. So a lot of time management, a lot of time talking. So now meditation, do a lot of meditation, as I said, a couple of hours a day. So generally, not this morning because I was on here. I was up at 6 this morning, had to get through a few emails. Then I'm here at 7 because it's about 7:45 here now. Then I've got another call at 8 o'clock. Then we put out a thing called Future Trends, which looks at global news stories, which give insight into the future. So that's going well. We've got about 40,000 subscribers now. So I do the editing on what goes into that at 9:30. Then I'll have a staff meeting at 11, and that'll be followed up with an interview with one of the major radio stations here in Sydney. So that's this morning. But quite often in the morning I'll do exercise. I've got a whole lot of different exercises I do. Been studying with some cave yogis out of Nepal over the last 3 years, and they've given me these stunning physical exercise. They work off the cardiovascular, they work off the balance, and they work off staying subtle and core strength as well. So they're just great, man. So that's part of my daily routine. Play golf, love golf. Then sort of in the evening, I'll sort of meditate for an hour before going to sleep. And sometimes I'm a bit tired, so I'll fall asleep. If I do, then quite often I'll be up at the if I fall asleep first, I'm always up 2 to 3 a.m. to meditate more. And sometimes I wake up at 2 to 3 a.m. and meditate anyway. So that's a rough idea of a sort of a day, my life.
Yeah.
I don't know if I mentioned, I've got golf too. I like golf as well. So I work a 60 to 70 hour week, just to put in perspective too. So you can work long weeks and can still have a really balanced life.
Well, that actually, you just hit on kind of what I wanted to get a sense of, and why I had asked the question is, how do you do the balance? And you really just kind of articulated that really well. There are a couple of comments in the chat which I think are really are worth reflecting on. A couple of people are reading your book, it looks like, so wonderful. And then, yeah, Marilyn Turkovich, who is the executive director for the charter, says, "Where do you find the most hope for the future?" Excellent question.
Right. Actually, I'm neither, how can I put it? I'm neither optimistic or pessimistic about the future. I think we live in a reality which has just got this conflict built within it, like different forces opposing each other, yin and yang, if you like, if you want to use an Eastern concept, good and evil, if you want to use a Western concept. And so the two are sort of there and sort of competing with each other. In some ways, comes back to Lisa's comments earlier on, that's the thing which motivates us to become better or maybe become worse, one of the two. And so you've got this dynamic, I think, built into reality around it. But I think what gives me hope is just individuals I meet from time to time. That just, some of them are just stunning. Like it blows me away. The ability for people to be able to lift and move beyond the circumstances of their lives, sometimes from appalling conditions, and sort of a real suffering. And like, I think take a lot of hope out of that sort of it's possible for all people to transform and become better people. The question is, how do you enable an environment for this to come about? And I guess the work at the Institute for Economics and Peace, it's about that when it's looking at the macro structures of society. Because what we'd say is positive peace creates an optimal environment for human potential to flourish. I think sort of as we move forward, some of the things which really worry me is just the extent of the modern weapons and just their destructive ability. But we may be moving towards an age, it's not here yet, where it's going to be impossible to defend yourself. And get to a point like that, then everyone has to start to now really think, well, what can we do with war? What can we do with war? And so look at so I think, I think sort of so if we look over history, and like this gets debated a bit, particularly with Pinker's work and our Better Angels. So if you look, some people would argue from the level of war, we've never had more people die of war than what we've had in the last century. Okay, and so that takes in the First, Second World Wars. You've got Vietnam War. then you've sort of got, if we look more recently, we've got Iraq, Syrian wars, and then the other major wars, but to a lesser extent, Libya. We've got Yemen going on at the moment, which is a human tragedy, and we can keep on going. But from another perspective, if you went into Elizabethan England and arrived at the gates of London, you'd see heads on a stake, okay? And like public executions in the 18th and 19th century were commonplace, okay? That was a form of entertainment. We don't think like that anymore. So in some ways, I think we're evolving. We really are evolving. I think and I think we are becoming more compassionate, more humane. And so I think that's probably, if I'm thinking about Marilyn, that's probably where I take the most hope and heart from.
I think that's a great answer. And one of the things that you've repeated a few times throughout the book is that that the change that's required is really to go slow and incremental. Is the way that it's going to be lasting change without having that backlash or negative loop in order to keep it in a positive referral loop is really helpful, I think, to keep in mind. I wonder, though, within that context of slow and steady change, when you hear that we only have about 60 years worth of healthy soil left on this planet, or that our 30 to 40 years left of sustainable life, really, for humans, that is. It's hard to it's hard to have faith in the slow and steady within this context. When,
No, I think that's it. So where we come at is from the systems concept, okay? And so really the flaw quite often is people come in and do one big change, okay, and they don't change the system, okay? Or they do a whole lot of small successful changes and it doesn't change the system. So what we're saying is change needs to be systemic, okay? So, and by a lot of small projects, they might be water capture projects in a village, okay? We'll put in 1,000 pumps into an area and now people's got water, but in the end, we don't really change the underlying poverty in it, okay? For something like that, or the governance of the system doesn't change even though we've improved the water. So the first thing is you've got to look at it systemically, okay? And what we say is you need many small nudges pushing it in the desired direction you want to go, and from many different directions. And that's very different than two small nudges, okay? So two small nudges, you're right, let's take a century to get anywhere. But if there's enough small nudges from many different directions, then it'll work. So let's say, and I could probably we're running out of time, so I won't get into a practical example. Oh yeah, I will actually. May as well finish up on this note. So there's an example of a project we did was done through Rotary in Uganda. They've been working, one of the clubs there, I think it's the Sissi Islands Club, had been working on a literacy program in the school for 18 months, 2 years, and got nowhere, okay, no change. And then a guy who'd done a positive peace workshops went in, got control of the project, and then implemented positive peace. So they took the literacy project and looked at it through the 8 different lenses and involved things for each one of them, okay? So there were implementations around each one, and it was just having the framework viewed and expanded their view of what actually constituted to part of the system, what the literacy project. So 2 things were, and none of the things they did were counterintuitive, but there were things like acceptance of the rights of others. So a lot of girls weren't coming to school 4 days a month, and they'd drop out of school, menstruating. They didn't have any pads, so they implemented separate toilet block for them and pads, and then they started to come back and attend school. That improved attendance rates and also scholastic performance rates. But then the thing which made the biggest difference, free flow of information. What they did then is they'd sort of, with the free flow of information, they went to the radio station and told them everything they were doing, okay? And that comes back, and it's really important after the next one. The thing which made the biggest difference was good relationships with neighbours, which is something you'd never consider in a school context. And what happened at lunchtime, these kids were going out and raiding the orchards or the fruit trees, it's more like it, in the neighbouring yards, because it was in a rural section. This was massively poor. This place is poorer than anything you can imagine. And so what happened is that this was causing friction with the local community. So the kids were doing it simply because they were hungry. They didn't get any, no one gave them any food for lunch. They all had to look after their own food. And so they put some fruit trees in the yard, then introduced a porridge feeding program at lunchtime. And sort of this was it only costs a few cents a kid to do. Like, so it's surprising how cheap it is to actually nutritionally feed someone. So out of IEP, we do a lot of famine relief at the moment. It's about 30 cents a person to keep them nutritionally alive. So if you put a porridge feeding program at lunchtime for kids, it's a few cents. And so what happened then, with the broadcasting it out on the radio and all the other, lots of other things as well, the attendance rates at the school jumped from in the 200s up into the 800s.
Wow.
The academic performance doubled. So they used to have 30% of the kids that get in the top two grades. That jumped to 60% of the kids. And because what was happening is they get to the afternoon and no nutrition's in the brain, and the brains would just get sluggish and they couldn't learn. A bit of food at lunchtime they learned. Now, they put that out on the radio. Parents hear about it on the radio. Now they send their kids to school because they know it's one less meal they have to worry about providing for. I think that's just about, we're out of time now, aren't we? But I think it's a good story on systemic thinking and sort of nudging from many, many different directions. There were a lot more in it as well, but they were the things which were the highlights.
Absolutely. And since we're running out of time, I'm going to just put your book up on the screen. I hope you can see it clearly. If you all have not had a chance to read it, please do check it out. And as importantly, I really would encourage everyone to go to Institute for Economics and Peace, which is economicsandpeace.org, and see the incredible research that Steve is responsible for, and his team, or teams I should say, for bringing into the world. Steve, thank you so much for being with us today. I'm deeply moved and appreciative of the work that you do and the way in which you are helping us transform and achieve a more peaceful and compassionate world. So thank you very much. I see something is being put on the screen. I'm assuming that that is Marilyn, who is now sharing screen with us, about to jump on and tell us about the next global read. So thank you very much, Steve. May your day flow with ease, grace, and meaning, and of course, compassion. Thank you so much.
Lovely. That's great saying, Lisa. Same to you too.
Thank you so much, Steve. And I just want to remind people that our next global read in February on the 9th is with Valerie Carr, See No Stranger. And to Steve, I don't want to keep you from your meeting. This is only going to take a couple minutes. So if you feel that you need to go, please do. I know that you have another call coming up. And just come to the website and see what we have in store for you. There's a lot of common sense, I think, in this year's global read, and Steve proved, what that common sense can really bring about. In March, we have 17-time New York Times bestseller, Jacqueline Winspear with her Maisie Dobbs character, but this time we're looking at Maisie because of the way that she solves problems and in a very compassionate way. For Earth Month, we have Mother, a tribute to Mother Earth with Dutch photographer Marcel van Osten. And then if you want to just check out all the global reads with background information, who is the facilitator, host, like Lisa has been today, everything is listed there. We're starting something brand new. And that is the Charter for Compassion film series. The first film is coming up on January 20th. It's Cracking the Codes, a System of Racial Inequality. And just to let you know, starting tomorrow, 40 Days of Peace, the Martin Luther King beloved community, every single day. From tomorrow until February 28th, we have a presentation. There are plays and films and music, individual presenting concepts and ideas, storytelling. So it should be a really exciting 40 days, and we welcome you to take a visit, go to the Charter website and find out about each of these days. Thank you, Lisa, so much, and thank you, everyone who has been in attendance today, and we hope to see you very soon. Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye. Thank you.